You watch as your colleagues backstab each other for promotions, while you naively believe merit alone will advance your career. Every day you witness less qualified people manipulate their way to the top, using tactics that make you uncomfortable, while your honest work goes unrecognized and unrewarded. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the political theorist who revealed the brutal realities of power that most dare not speak aloud. For over 500 years, my observations about human nature and political maneuvering have guided those who understand that power operates by different rules than ordinary morality. What I discovered about the dark psychology of absolute power will transform how you navigate any hierarchy, whether in politics, business, or social situations. The same principles that toppled princes and built empires can help you understand and ethically navigate the power games happening around you every day. But first, like this video, subscribe for more forbidden wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to understand power's true nature. I was not born understanding the dark psychology of power. Like you, I once believed in the nobility of human nature and the triumph of virtue over vice. My transformation began in the marble halls of Florence, where I witnessed the collision between idealism and reality that would shape my understanding. Forever in my youth, I watched the rise and fall of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who promised to purify Florence through moral reformation. The people loved him for his passionate sermons against corruption, his calls for justice, and his vision of a righteous republic. I too was swept up in his vision of virtue triumphant. Here, I thought, was proof that goodness could prevail over the machinations of the powerful. But I held in my hands what I call the diplomatic seal knot, merely a piece of wax and metal, but a symbol of the harsh awakening that would define my life's work. This seal bore witness to the moment I understood that virtue without power is merely weakness dressed in noble clothing. Savonarola's downfall came not through the force of better arguments or the weight of moral authority, but through the calculated maneuvering of those who understood power's true nature. Pope Alexander VI, the Medici family, and other powerful enemies didn't defeat Savonarola's ideas. They simply made his position untenable through political pressure, economic warfare, and strategic alliances. I watched as this man of unquestionable virtue was excommunicated, tortured, and burned at the stake, not because his ideas were wrong, but because he failed to understand that moral authority means nothing without the practical ability to enforce it. The crowds that once cheered his sermons stood silent as the flames consumed him. In that moment, I learned that popular support is as changeable as the weather and just as unreliable as a foundation for lasting power. This was my first glimpse into what I would later call the nature of the beast. Human beings, I realized, are not inherently good or evil. They are inherently self-interested. They will follow virtue when it serves them and abandon it when it doesn't. They will support a leader when that leader can protect and benefit them, and they will turn on that same leader the moment he appears weak or unable to deliver on his promises. I began to study power not because I was naturally drawn to darkness, but because I witnessed the tragic consequences of ignoring its realities. I saw good men destroyed by their refusal to acknowledge that the world operates according to different rules than those taught in churches and philosophy schools. I watched noble intentions crumble before practical politics. My position in the Florentine government gave me access to the diplomatic correspondence, the secret negotiations, and the private conversations where real decisions were made. I learned that behind every public proclamation of virtue lay private calculations of advantage. Behind every treaty lay the threat of force. Behind every alliance lay the possibility of betrayal. The diplomatic seal taught me that power is not about what you deserve or what you intend. It's about what you can achieve and maintain. This understanding would guide everything I would later write, and every piece of advice I would offer to princes and leaders. The world judges results, not intentions. History remembers effectiveness, not purity of heart. In my years observing the rise and fall of princes, I discovered a truth that makes most people uncomfortable. Fear is more reliable than love as a foundation for lasting power. This realization came to me not through abstract philosophy, but through witnessing the practical consequences of leaders who chose different approaches to maintaining authority. I keep with me the memory of the lion's claw symbol that represents the delicate balance between inspiring fear and commanding respect. The lion, you see, is both magnificent and terrifying. It commands admiration for its strength and fear for its capability to destroy. This is the essence of effective leadership that most people refuse to acknowledge. Consider the psychology of human nature as I have observed it in countless courts and countless conflicts. When people love their leader, that love is conditional and changeable. It depends on the leader continuing to provide benefits, continuing to meet expectations, and continuing to appear strong and capable. Love, beautiful though it may be, is fundamentally selfish. People love leaders who make them feel good about themselves and their circumstances. But fear properly understood and properly applied creates predictability. When people fear the consequences of crossing you, they behave in ways that support your authority regardless of their personal feelings. Fear doesn't require that you constantly prove yourself worthy of affection. It doesn't depend on your ability to continually provide benefits or meet ever-increasing expectations. I learned this lesson most clearly while studying Cesare Borgia, perhaps the most effective practitioner of fear-based leadership I ever encountered. Borgia understood that cruelty, properly timed and precisely applied, could prevent far greater suffering later. When he conquered Romania, he appointed Ramiro de Orco as his lieutenant, a man known for his harsh methods. De Orco's brutality quickly established order in the region, eliminating the petty tyrants and bandits who had made life miserable for ordinary citizens. But here lies the sophistication of Borgia's approach. Once order was established, he had de Orco executed in the public square, his body displayed for all to see. This single act accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It demonstrated Borgia's power to his subjects. It removed a subordinate who had become too associated with cruelty, and it satisfied the people's desire for justice, while maintaining the order that de Orco's harsh methods had created. The psychology behind this maneuver reveals the deeper truth about fear-based leadership. Borgia didn't rule through random violence or constant terror. He ruled through the calculated demonstration that crossing him would bring swift and certain consequences, while serving him faithfully would bring protection and advancement. His subjects knew exactly where they stood and what was expected of them. This predictability is what makes fear more reliable than love. When people understand the clear consequences of their actions, they make rational decisions that support stability. When they must constantly guess what will please a leader they love, they become anxious and make mistakes that destabilize the system. I want you to understand that I'm not advocating for needless cruelty or the abuse of power for its own sake. What I'm describing is the uncomfortable reality that effective leadership sometimes requires making decisions that cause immediate discomfort to prevent greater suffering later. The leader who cannot inspire appropriate fear when necessary will eventually preside over chaos that hurts everyone. In modern terms, think of the manager who is beloved by everyone but cannot make difficult decisions. Eventually, that manager's inability to impose necessary discipline destroys team performance and hurts the very people who loved them. The manager who can make tough calls when needed, who can inspire appropriate concern about consequences, creates an environment where everyone can succeed. The Venetian mask has always fascinated me, not for its beauty, but for what it represents, about the necessity of concealing one's true intentions in the pursuit of power. Throughout my career in diplomacy and politics, I learned that deception is not the vice that moralists claim it to be, but rather an essential tool for anyone who must navigate complex human relationships and competing interests. Let me be clear about what I mean by deception, because this is where most people misunderstand my teachings. I'm not talking about lying for personal gain or breaking promises for convenience. I'm talking about the strategic concealment of information and intentions when revealing them would lead to greater harm, or prevent you from achieving necessary objectives. Learned this lesson during my diplomatic missions to France and Germany, where I witnessed master practitioners of political deception. King Louis XII of France would smile warmly at his enemies while secretly negotiating their destruction with their rivals. Emperor Maximilian would promise support to multiple conflicting parties, keeping his options open until the optimal moment to choose sides. These leaders understood that premature honesty often destroys opportunities for beneficial outcomes. The psychology of deception in leadership contexts is more complex than simple dishonesty. When you reveal your true intentions too early, you give your opponents the advantage of preparation. When you show your complete hand in negotiations, you eliminate your leverage. When you express your genuine feelings about difficult decisions, you often create resistance that makes those decisions impossible to implement. Consider the leader who must restructure an organization to save it from bankruptcy. If he announces his complete plan immediately, panic ensues. Valuable employees flee. Customers lose confidence, and the very measures needed to save the organization become impossible to implement. But if he reveals his strategy gradually, maintaining confidence while implementing necessary changes, he can preserve the organization and protect everyone's jobs. This is what I call constructive deception, the strategic management of information to achieve outcomes that benefit the greater good. It requires tremendous skill and moral discipline, because the temptation to use these techniques for purely selfish purposes is always present. I observed this principle most clearly in my interactions with the various Italian city-states. Each believed they were my true allies, and in a sense they were. I genuinely wanted all of them to prosper and remain independent. But I could not reveal my complete strategy to any of them, because their individual interests sometimes conflicted with the broader goal of Italian unity and independence from foreign powers. The Venetian mask taught me that effective leaders must often wear faces that serve the situation rather than express their inner emotional state. This doesn't mean becoming a sociopath who feels nothing genuine. It means developing the discipline to separate your public role from your private feelings when circumstances require it. I learned to read the deceptions of others by understanding their motivations and constraints. When someone spoke too passionately about their noble intentions, I looked for the practical benefits they weren't mentioning. When someone offered a deal that seemed too generous, I searched for the hidden costs or obligations. When someone appeared completely honest and transparent, I considered what they might be concealing behind that appearance of honesty. The most sophisticated practitioners of political deception are those who rarely lie outright, but instead shape perception through selective truth-telling, strategic timing, and careful framing. They understand that people want to believe certain things about the world and about themselves, and they craft their communications to work with these natural inclinations rather than against them. But here's the crucial distinction. Masterful deception in leadership is ultimately about serving purposes larger than yourself. When you deceive purely for personal advantage, you become a manipulator who will eventually be exposed and destroyed. When you deceive to protect others or to achieve necessary objectives that serve the common good, you become a strategic leader who can navigate complex situations successfully. I carry with me the image of the broken crown symbol that reminds me of the fundamental contradiction at the heart of all power relationships. Every leader desperately needs loyalty to maintain their position. Yet absolute loyalty is both impossible to achieve and dangerous to expect. This paradox has destroyed more rulers than any external enemy ever could. In my years studying the courts of Europe, I witnessed the tragic consequences of leaders who either trusted too much or trusted too little. Those who demanded absolute loyalty often drove away their most capable advisors, surrounding themselves with sycophants who told them what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. Those who trusted no one became paralyzed by paranoia, unable to delegate effectively or build the alliances necessary for lasting success. The psychology of loyalty is more complex than most people realize. True loyalty, the kind that endures through hardship and temptation, is extremely rare and usually conditional. Most people are loyal to you as long as serving you serves their interests. This isn't a moral failing, it's human nature. People have families to feed, ambitions to pursue, and survival instincts that ultimately supersede their devotion to any leader. Kay learned this lesson most painfully during the collapse of the Florentine Republic. Men who had sworn unwavering loyalty to our cause abandoned us the moment it became clear that the Medici were returning to power. These weren't evil men or natural traitors, they were practical people who recognized that their first duty was to their own survival and the welfare of their families. The broken crown taught me that expecting absolute loyalty is not only unrealistic but counterproductive. When you demand impossible standards of devotion, you create a culture of pretense where people feel compelled to lie about their true feelings and motivations. This prevents you from getting the honest feedback you need to make good decisions. Instead, I learned to build what I call strategic loyalty relationships based on mutual benefit, clear expectations, and honest acknowledgement of each person's legitimate self. When people understand how serving your objectives also serves their own goals, you create alignment that is far more reliable than emotional devotion. Consider how Cesare Borgia managed this challenge. He never expected his subordinates to love him unconditionally, but he made it very clear that their prosperity depended on his success. He rewarded loyalty generously and punished betrayal swiftly, creating a system where rational self-interest supported faithful service. Most importantly, he regularly rotated key positions to prevent any individual from becoming too powerful or too comfortable. The psychology of betrayal is equally important to understand. Most betrayals don't come from people who intended to be disloyal from the beginning. They come from people whose circumstances or perspectives changed, making continued loyalty feel impossible or foolish. The subordinate who discovers you've been lying to him, the advisor whose counsel you consistently ignore, the ally whose interests you've sacrificed for your own convenience. These are the sources of the most dangerous betrayals. I developed techniques for identifying the warning signs of shifting loyalty. When someone begins questioning your decisions more frequently, when they start building relationships with your potential rivals, when they become less available for important conversations, these are signals that their commitment is wavering. The key is to address these situations early, either by repairing the relationship or by limiting that person's access to sensitive information. But here's the most sophisticated aspect of managing the loyalty paradox. You must appear to trust people more than you actually do. Public displays of confidence in your subordinates encourage them to live up to your expectations, while private precautions protect you from the consequences if they don't. This isn't cynicism, it's practical wisdom. The leaders who master this paradox understand that loyalty is not a fixed quality but a dynamic relationship that must be continuously earned and maintained. They invest in their people's success, communicate clearly about expectations and consequences, and create systems that make betrayal costly while making faithful service rewarding. The spinning wheel has haunted my thoughts for decades. Perfect, symbol of fortune's capricious nature and the challenge she presents to anyone who seeks lasting power. Throughout my career, I've watched brilliant leaders destroyed by unexpected events and mediocre ones elevated by circumstances beyond their control. Understanding fortune's role in human affairs is perhaps the most crucial skill any leader can develop. I learned about fortune's power during my diplomatic mission to France, where I witnessed how quickly political situations can transform. King Louis XII appeared unassailable, with vast armies and wealthy territories under his control. Yet within a few years, a series of unexpected alliances and military defeats left him vulnerable to enemies he had previously dominated. The king's character hadn't changed, nor had his fundamental capabilities, but fortune had turned her wheel, and he was unprepared for the new reality. The psychology of fortune is that she rewards those who understand her nature while destroying those who ignore her influence. Most people make one of two mistakes when dealing with uncertainty. They either become paralyzed by the impossibility of predicting the future, or they assume that current conditions will continue indefinitely. Both approaches lead to disaster. Fortune favors the prepared mind, but preparation alone is insufficient. You must also maintain the flexibility to adapt quickly when circumstances change. I observed this principle in action during the rise of Cesare Borgia, who understood that his father's papacy created a temporary window of opportunity that would not remain open forever. While other ambitious men spent years developing elaborate long-term plans, Borgia moved swiftly to consolidate power while conditions favored him. The spinning wheel taught me that fortune is not entirely random. She has patterns and preferences that the observant can learn to recognize. She tends to favor bold action over cautious deliberation, especially during moments of crisis or transition. She rewards those who can see opportunities that others miss and who have the courage to act on incomplete information. But fortune is also jealous of those who become too comfortable with her favors. I've noticed that extended periods of success often make leaders complacent, causing them to attribute their achievements entirely to their own abilities, while forgetting the role that favorable circumstances played. When fortune's wheel turns, as it inevitably does, these leaders are unprepared for adversity, because they never developed the skills needed to navigate difficult times. The most sophisticated understanding of fortune recognizes that she offers different types of opportunities at different moments. Sometimes she provides chances for rapid expansion and bold initiatives. Other times she counsels patience and consolidation. The wise leader learns to read these signals and adjust their approach accordingly. I developed what I call fortune's rhythm, an understanding of when to push forward aggressively and when to prepare defenses against coming storms. During periods of political stability, I focused on building relationships and gathering intelligence. During moments of crisis, I looked for ways to turn chaos to my advantage, while others were struggling simply to survive. The psychology of dealing with uncertainty requires a particular kind of mental discipline. You must plan as if your strategies will succeed while simultaneously preparing for their failure. You must act with confidence while maintaining the humility to recognize when circumstances require a change. Of course, you must embrace calculated risks while avoiding the kind of reckless gambling that destroys more leaders than cowardice ever could. I learned to create what I call fortunes, allies, multiple options, and contingency plans that allow rapid adaptation when the unexpected occurs. When negotiating with foreign powers, I always identified alternative partners in case primary relationships failed. When implementing domestic policies, I prepared explanations for both success and failure. When building military capabilities, I ensured that strategies could be modified based on enemy responses. The leaders who master fortune's principles understand that adaptability is more valuable than rigid planning. They build systems that can function under various scenarios rather than optimizing for a single expected outcome. They cultivate diverse sources of information so they can detect changes in the political weather before their competitors do. The surgeon's blade represents perhaps the most difficult truth I must share with you, that mercy, when applied at the wrong time or in the wrong circumstances, becomes cruelty to the many in service of kindness to the few. Throughout my career, I witnessed countless leaders destroy themselves and their people through misplaced compassion and the inability to make harsh decisions when circumstances demanded them. I learned this lesson most clearly during the French invasion of Italy, when I watched well-intentioned leaders choose gentleness over effectiveness and doom their subjects to far greater suffering as a result. The psychology of ruthlessness is not about enjoying the pain of others or choosing cruelty for its own sake. It's about having the moral courage to accept responsibility for difficult decisions that serve the greater good. Consider the leader who discovers corruption within his organization. The merciful approach might be to give the corrupt individuals multiple chances to reform, to try rehabilitation rather than punishment, to hope that gentle persuasion will solve the problem. But while this leader exercises his compassion toward a few wrongdoers, the corruption spreads. Honest employees become demoralized. The organization's mission suffers. And ultimately, many more people are harmed than would have been hurt by swift and decisive action. The surgeon's blade taught me that effective leadership sometimes requires causing immediate pain to prevent greater suffering later. When a surgeon removes diseased tissue, he causes trauma to save the patient's life. When a leader removes toxic individuals from an organization, he causes distress to preserve the health of the whole. The key distinction is that this kind of ruthlessness serves purposes larger than the leader's personal comfort or convenience. I observed this principle in action during my study of successful military commanders, those who hesitated to discipline insubordinate soldiers who tried to maintain popularity by avoiding tough decisions, inevitably presided over armies that collapsed under pressure. But commanders who enforced discipline strictly, who were willing to be hated by individuals in order to protect the unit, created forces that could endure incredible hardships and achieve seemingly impossible victories. The psychology of necessary ruthlessness requires a particular kind of mental discipline. You must train yourself to think beyond immediate emotional responses and consider long-term consequences. You must develop the ability to act against your natural desire to be liked, when doing so serves a higher purpose. Most importantly, you must learn to distinguish between ruthlessness that serves noble objectives and cruelty that serves only your own ego or interests. I developed what I call the Ruthlessness Tester series of questions I asked myself before taking harsh action. Does this decision serve the common good rather than my personal interests? Have I exhausted reasonable alternatives? Will the short-term pain prevent greater long-term suffering? Am I acting from rational calculation rather than anger or revenge? If I could answer yes to all these questions, I proceeded regardless of personal discomfort. The most sophisticated practitioners of necessary ruthlessness understand that timing is crucial. Acting too harshly too early creates resentment and resistance. Acting too gently too late allows problems to become crises. The skill lies in recognizing the moment when decisive action becomes both necessary and effective. I learned to communicate ruthless decisions in ways that helped people understand the larger purpose being served. When I had to disappoint allies or impose difficult requirements, I explained the reasoning behind my choices and the consequences of alternative approaches. This didn't eliminate the pain of hard decisions, but it helped people see that the harshness served objectives they could support. The leaders who master this principle understand that true compassion sometimes requires causing immediate discomfort to prevent greater future suffering. They develop the emotional resilience to be disliked by individuals when necessary to protect the welfare of the many. They learn to act decisively when circumstances demand it, regardless of their personal preference for gentler alternatives. But they never lose sight of the fact that ruthlessness is a tool, not a goal. The moment you begin enjoying the exercise of harsh power, you have crossed the line from necessary leadership into dangerous tyranny. The town crier's bell echoes through my memory as a symbol of one of power's most essential yet dangerous tools: ability to shape public perception and control the narrative that defines reality for the masses. Throughout my career in politics and diplomacy, I learned that managing information is often more important than managing actual events, because people respond to what they believe to be true rather than to objective reality. I first understood the power of narrative control during the papacy of Alexander VI, who transformed his image from a corrupt politician into a spiritual leader through carefully orchestrated public appearances, strategic charitable works, and the systematic suppression of unfavorable information. What fascinated me was not the deception itself, but the willing participation of the public in maintaining illusions that served their psychological needs. The psychology of mass persuasion operates on principles that most people prefer not to acknowledge. Humans are not primarily rational creatures who carefully evaluate evidence before forming opinions. They are emotional beings who form conclusions based on feelings and then use their considerable intelligence to justify those conclusions with selective facts and logical reasoning. Understanding this reality is crucial for any leader, who must maintain public support while making difficult decisions. The public doesn't want to know about the moral complexity of leadership choices or the tragic trade-offs that every significant decision requires. They want simple narratives that confirm their existing beliefs and make them feel good about supporting their leaders. The town crier's bell taught me that effective propaganda, and I use that term without shame, is not about lying to people, but about presenting truth in ways that serve constructive purposes. When I crafted diplomatic communications or public statements, I focused on emphasizing aspects of reality that supported beneficial outcomes, while de-emphasizing aspects that would create panic, division, or paralysis. Consider the leader who must announce layoffs to save an organization from bankruptcy. The brutal truth is that some people will lose their jobs so that others can keep theirs. But effective communication might emphasize the steps being taken to support displaced workers, the long-term security being created for remaining employees, and the organization's commitment to avoiding future layoffs. These are all truthful statements that serve the psychological needs of various audiences. I learned to identify the core stories that different groups tell themselves about their identity and their relationship to authority. Florentine merchants wanted to believe they were building something greater than mere commercial success. They were creating civilization itself. Foreign diplomats wanted to believe they were sophisticated players in grand games of international politics. Ordinary citizens wanted to believe their leaders were competent and their sacrifices meaningful. The most effective approach to narrative management is to work with these existing stories rather than against them. When people already want to believe something that supports your objectives, your task is simply to provide them with credible evidence and compelling presentation. When people's natural inclinations work against your goals, you must find ways to reframe the situation that allow them to support you while maintaining their self-respect. I developed techniques for managing different types of information flow. For favorable news, I ensured wide distribution through multiple channels and encouraged detailed discussion. For unfavorable news, I controlled the timing of release, provided context that minimized damage, and quickly shifted attention to more positive developments. For complex issues that required nuanced understanding, I used trusted intermediaries to explain my position rather than trying to communicate directly with mass audiences. The psychology of credibility is particularly important in propaganda. efforts, people are more likely to believe information that comes from sources they already trust, and that confirms beliefs they already hold. This means that changing public opinion requires patience and the careful cultivation of trusted messengers, who can gradually introduce new ideas without triggering defensive reactions. I learned to monitor the effectiveness of my communications by watching behavior rather than listening to stated opinions. People might claim to support your position while acting in ways that undermine it, or they might express skepticism while behaving in ways that suggest they've been influenced by your arguments. The leaders who master narrative control understand that public perception is not separate from political reality, is political reality. The most brilliant policies will fail if they cannot be communicated effectively, while mediocre initiatives can succeed if they capture the public imagination. The spider's web has always fascinated me as a perfect metaphor for the complex network of relationships that determines success or failure in any political environment. Like a spider's web, political alliances appear delicate but possess surprising strength when properly constructed. They require constant maintenance, and a single broken strand can compromise the entire structure, if not quickly repaired. I learned the intricacies of alliance building during my diplomatic missions throughout Europe, where I witnessed both masterful relationship management and catastrophic failures of political networking. The psychology of strategic partnerships operates on principles that extend far beyond simple friendship or mutual advantage. It requires understanding the deeper motivations, fears, and aspirations that drive human behavior in competitive environments. The most common mistake I observed was leaders who approached alliances as transactions rather than relationships. They would offer immediate benefits in exchange for immediate support, but they failed to create the deeper bonds that sustain partnerships. Through difficult periods, when circumstances changed or better offers appeared, these transactional alliances collapsed instantly, often leaving their creators worse off than before. The spider's web taught me that effective alliances must serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They should provide mutual benefits in the short term, create shared interests for the long term, and establish emotional connections that make betrayal psychologically difficult. The strongest partnerships are those where each party's success becomes genuinely important to the other's welfare. I developed what I call the alliance perimeter, systematic approach to building relationships at different levels of intensity and commitment. At the base are casual associations with people who might occasionally be useful but who require minimal investment. In the middle are strategic partnerships with individuals whose goals align with yours in specific areas. At the top are core alliances with people whose fundamental interests are so intertwined with yours that betraying you would harm them significantly. The psychology of mutual dependence is crucial to understand. When people feel they need you more than you need them, they become anxious and potentially unreliable. When they feel you need them more than they need you, they become demanding and potentially exploitative. The ideal alliance creates a sense of mutual vulnerability where both parties have strong incentives to maintain the relationship. I learned to identify valuable potential allies by looking beyond obvious qualifications to assess deeper qualities. The most reliable partners are often those who have something to prove rather than those who have already achieved everything they want. Ambitious individuals who see association with you as a step toward their larger goals will invest heavily in the relationship's success. The most sophisticated aspect of alliance management is playing multiple sides without losing credibility. Throughout the Italian wars, I maintained relationships with various competing factions, each believing I was primarily loyal to their cause. This wasn't deception for its own sake. It was recognition that circumstances change rapidly in politics, and yesterday's enemy might become tomorrow's essential ally. The spider's web also taught me about the danger of alliance. Entanglement. When your partnerships become too numerous or too complex, you risk being pulled in conflicting directions or being forced to choose between equally important relationships. The skill lies in maintaining enough connections to have options while avoiding commitments that might paralyze you. When decisive action becomes necessary, I developed techniques for managing alliance tensions when partner interests diverged. Sometimes this meant helping allies find face-saving ways to adjust their positions. Other times it required taking actions that disappointed one partner to preserve a more important relationship. The key was always to be transparent about constraints and to help people understand why certain choices were necessary. The psychology of alliance dissolution is as important as alliance formation. Relationships will end, and how they end determines whether former allies become neutral parties or active enemies. I learned to create exit strategies that allowed partnerships to conclude with dignity intact, often preserving the possibility of future cooperation even when current collaboration became impossible. The most successful practitioners of alliance politics understand that relationship building is not separate from their core objectives. It is fundamental to achieving those objectives. They invest time and energy in their network even when immediate benefits aren't apparent, because they understand that political capital, like financial capital, must be accumulated before it's needed. The empty throne haunts every leader's imagination, a stark reminder that all power is temporary, and that the greatest challenge facing any successful ruler is ensuring that their achievements survive their departure. Throughout my observations of European courts, I witnessed how the failure to manage succession properly could destroy decades of careful work within months of a leader's death or removal from office. I learned about succession psychology during the chaos that followed the death of Pope Alexander VI, when the carefully constructed power base of his son Cesare Borgia collapsed almost overnight. Borgia had been one of the most effective practitioners of political power I ever encountered, yet he failed to solve the fundamental problem that faces every leader: how to transfer authority without creating a vacuum that enemies can exploit. The psychology of succession involves several competing tensions that most leaders handle poorly. First, there's the natural human reluctance to contemplate mortality and loss of power. Most leaders postpone succession planning because thinking about their replacement feels like admitting weakness or inviting challenges to their current authority. This procrastination often proves fatal to their legacy. Second, there's the paradox of preparing successors without threatening your own position. Anyone capable enough to succeed you is potentially capable enough to replace you before you're ready to step down. This creates a temptation to either choose weak successors who won't challenge you, or to avoid succession planning altogether. Both approaches lead to organizational collapse. The empty throne taught me that effective succession planning requires a fundamental shift in how leaders think about their role and their legacy. Instead of viewing their position as personal property to be protected, they must see themselves as temporary stewards of institutional power that must be transferred intact to the next generation. I observed successful succession management in the Venetian Republic, where constitutional mechanisms ensured smooth transitions of power even when individual leaders died unexpectedly. The Venetians understood that institutions must be stronger than individuals, and they created systems that could function regardless of who occupied specific positions. But hereditary succession, as practiced by most European monarchies, presented different challenges. The psychology of inherited power creates unique problems because successors often lack the skills and motivation that enabled their predecessors to gain authority in the first place. Power that is inherited rather than earned frequently leads to complacency, incompetence, or both. I developed what I call the succession triangular framework for addressing the three essential elements of power transfer. First, The successor must have the skills necessary to handle the responsibilities they will inherit. Second, they must have the legitimacy required to command respect from important constituencies. Third, they must have the support systems needed to maintain power against inevitable challenges. The most sophisticated succession planning involves gradually transferring authority while the current leader remains in position to provide guidance and support. This allows successors to develop confidence and competence while having a safety net if they make serious mistakes. It also gives the organization time to adjust to new leadership styles without experiencing dramatic disruptions. I learned that succession crises often begin long before the actual transition of power. When key subordinates lose confidence in the succession plan, they begin making alternative arrangements that can undermine the current leader's authority. When external rivals sense weakness in the succession process, they start preparing challenges that will emerge the moment transition begins. The psychology of the succession period is particularly treacherous because everyone's incentives become misaligned. The current leader wants to maintain control. The designated successor wants to establish independence. Key subordinates want to position themselves advantageously with the new regime, and external competitors want to exploit the confusion. Managing these conflicting pressures requires exceptional skill and careful timing. I witnessed the catastrophic failure of succession planning during the final years of several Italian city-states, where aging leaders refused to acknowledge their declining capabilities or prepare adequate replacements. Their organizations became increasingly dysfunctional as everyone waited for the inevitable transition, while no one wanted to take responsibility for difficult decisions that might be reversed by new leadership. The most effective succession strategies I observed involve creating what I call succession momentum, a gradual shift of authority that feels natural and inevitable, rather than forced or premature. This requires the current leader to suppress their ego and focus on their legacy, understanding that their greatest achievement will be creating something that outlasts their personal involvement. The empty throne ultimately taught me that succession is not just about choosing the right person, it's about creating the right conditions for that person to succeed. This means building institutions that can support new leadership, establishing relationships that will transfer to successors, and creating cultural expectations that make smooth transitions feel normal rather than exceptional. The scales of justice represent one of the most delicate balancing acts in all of politics, managing the relationship between elite power and popular will. Throughout my career, I observed how leaders who ignored the people eventually faced revolution, while those who gave the people everything they wanted often presided over chaos that hurt everyone. Understanding mass psychology is essential for anyone who must maintain authority in systems where popular opinion matters. I learned about the complexity of popular sentiment during the rise and fall of various Republican governments in Italy, where I witnessed how quickly public opinion could shift from adoration to hatred, often based on circumstances beyond any leader's control. The psychology of crowds is fundamentally different from the psychology of individuals. Masses think and feel in ways that are more primitive, more emotional, and more susceptible to manipulation than rational persons acting alone. The most important insight I gained about mass psychology is that people don't actually want what they say they want. When crowds demand democracy, they usually mean they want their particular interests represented. When they call for justice, they typically mean they want their enemies punished. When they advocate for change, they generally hope to improve their own circumstances rather than transform society for everyone's benefit. The scales of justice taught me that effective leadership requires giving people what they need while making them feel like they're getting what they want. This isn't cynical manipulation, it's recognition that popular desires are often contradictory, short-sighted, or based on incomplete information. The skilled leader learns to channel popular energy toward beneficial outcomes, rather than simply following every shift in public opinion. I observed this principle in action during periods of economic hardship, when populations simultaneously demanded lower taxes and increased government services. Leaders who simply tried to satisfy both demands inevitably failed and were blamed for the resulting problems. But leaders who found ways to appear responsive while making necessary choices often maintained popularity even during difficult periods. The psychology of popular support operates on emotional rather than rational foundations. People support leaders who make them feel important, protected, and hopeful about the future. They abandon leaders who make them feel ignored, vulnerable, or pessimistic, regardless of those leaders' actual competence or achievements. This means that communication and symbolism are often more important than policy substance in maintaining popular support. I learned to distinguish between what I call surface opinion and deep sentiment. Surface opinion is what people say they believe when asked by pollsters or in casual conversation. Deep sentiment is the underlying emotional current that actually drives political behavior. Smart leaders pay attention to both, but make decisions based on deep sentiment rather than surface opinion. The most dangerous mistake is to assume that popular support, once gained, will remain stable. The psychology of crowds is inherently fickle. Same people who cheer you today will abandon you tomorrow if circumstances change or if a more appealing alternative appears. This means that maintaining popular support requires constant attention and regular demonstration of value. I developed what I call the popular mandate strategy, a systematic approach to building and maintaining mass support that goes beyond simple pandering. This involves identifying the core concerns that unite different segments of the population, addressing those concerns through concrete actions, and communicating success in ways that make people feel their trust has been justified. The scales of justice also taught me about the danger of becoming too dependent on popular approval. Leaders who need constant validation from the masses often become paralyzed when tough decisions require acting against public opinion. The skill lies in maintaining enough popular support to remain legitimate while preserving enough independence to make necessary but unpopular choices. I observed that the most effective popular leaders are those who appear to be one of the people while actually maintaining the discipline and strategic thinking necessary for effective governance. They master the art of seeming accessible and relatable while keeping enough distance to make objective decisions about complex issues. The relationship between elite interests and popular welfare is not always antagonistic, but it's rarely perfectly aligned. Wise leaders look for opportunities to serve both simultaneously while recognizing that sometimes they must choose between them. When such choices become necessary, the key is to act decisively while explaining the reasoning in ways that help people understand why their short-term desires must sometimes be sacrificed for their long-term benefit. The architect's blueprint has guided my thinking about one of leadership's most challenging tasks, implementing necessary changes in systems that resist transformation. Throughout my observations of successful and failed reforms across Europe, I learned that innovation is not just about having good ideas. It's about understanding the psychology of change and developing strategies that overcome natural human resistance to new ways of doing things. I first encountered the power of strategic innovation during my study of military tactics, where I observed how traditional fighting methods became obsolete almost overnight when new technologies and strategies emerged. The leaders who adapted quickly gained enormous advantages, while those who clung to familiar approaches found themselves defeated by supposedly inferior forces. Using superior methods, the psychology of resistance to change operates on both individual and institutional levels. People resist innovation not because they're inherently conservative, but because change threatens their sense of competence, status, and security. When you introduce new systems, you're implicitly telling people that their current knowledge and skills may become less valuable. This creates anxiety that often manifests as opposition to even beneficial changes. The architect's blueprint taught me that successful innovation requires more than technical excellence, requires political skill and psychological insight. You must understand who benefits from current arrangements and who might be threatened by proposed changes. You must identify allies who will gain from innovation and neutralize opponents who might sabotage your efforts. I learned this lesson during attempts to reform Florentine military systems, where I advocated for citizen militias to replace unreliable mercenary forces. The idea was sound from a strategic perspective, but it threatened the interests of military contractors, challenged the assumptions of traditional commanders, and required citizens to accept new responsibilities they weren't sure they wanted. Success required addressing all these concerns simultaneously. The most effective approach to implementing innovation is what I call progressive revelation, introducing changes gradually in ways that allow people to adjust their thinking and behavior without feeling overwhelmed or threatened. This might mean starting with pilot programs that demonstrate benefits before attempting full-scale implementation, or finding ways to frame new approaches as improvements to existing systems rather than radical departures. The psychology of early adoption is crucial to understand. In any organization, there are individuals who are naturally inclined toward innovation and others who are deeply resistant to change. The key is to identify and cultivate the early adopters while avoiding premature confrontation with the resistors. Once early adopters demonstrate success with new approaches, resistance often diminishes naturally as people see concrete benefits rather than theoretical threats. I developed what I call the innovation sandwicher strategy for embedding new ideas between familiar concepts and trusted relationships. When introducing radical changes, I would present them as logical extensions of accepted principles, implemented by people who already had credibility with key stakeholders. This made innovation feel less threatening and more inevitable. The architect's blueprint also taught me about the importance of timing in innovation efforts. Attempting change during periods of stability often triggers unnecessary resistance, because people don't see compelling reasons to abandon approaches that seem to be working adequately. But during crisis periods, people become more open to new solutions because their current methods have obviously failed. The most sophisticated innovation strategies address both the rational and emotional aspects of change resistance. People need logical reasons to support new approaches, but they also need emotional reassurance that change won't destroy everything they value about current arrangements. Effective change leaders provide both analytical justification and psychological comfort. I learned to anticipate and prepare for what I call innovation backlash, the tendency for initial enthusiasm about change to give way to nostalgia for old methods when new approaches encounter their first serious difficulties. Every innovation goes through periods of struggle and adjustment, and during these times, opponents will argue that the changes have failed and should be abandoned. The leaders who successfully implement lasting innovation understand that change is not an event but a process that requires sustained attention and continuous adaptation. They build systems that can evolve rather than trying to create perfect solutions that will never need modification. They cultivate cultures that value learning and adjustment rather than demanding immediate perfection from new approaches. The Trojan horse stands as history's perfect symbol of the most dangerous threat any leader faces: the enemy who appears as a friend, the betrayal that comes from within, the destruction that emerges from trust misplaced. Throughout my career in the treacherous world of Italian politics, I learned that external enemies, no matter how powerful, are less dangerous than internal threats that have access to your secrets, your resources, and your confidence. I discovered The psychology of internal threats during my service in the Florentine government, where I witnessed how trusted advisors could become instruments of destruction when their loyalties shifted, or when they were compromised by outside forces. The most devastating betrayals came not from obvious enemies, but from people who had intimate knowledge of our plans, our weaknesses, and our decision-making processes. The challenge of identifying internal threats lies in understanding that most organizational sabotage doesn't come from people who intend to be traitors from the beginning. Instead, it emerges from individuals whose circumstances, motivations, or allegiances gradually change in ways that make them willing to harm the organization they once served faithfully. These people are particularly dangerous because they maintain the appearance of loyalty while actively working against your interests. The Trojan horse taught me that internal security requires a different approach than external defense. You cannot simply build walls against people who are already inside your organization. Instead, you must develop systems that can detect changes in behavior, motivation, and loyalty before they translate into destructive action. I learned to identify the warning signs of shifting allegiance by observing patterns rather than listening to declarations. When someone begins asking unusual questions about sensitive matters, when they start building relationships with your rivals, when they become less available for important conversations or more critical of routine decisions, these behaviors often signal that their loyalty is wavering, even if they haven't consciously decided to betray you yet. The psychology of organizational betrayal operates on several levels simultaneously. Sometimes people turn against their leaders because they feel undervalued or mistreated. Other times they're motivated by better opportunities elsewhere. Occasionally, they're driven by ideological differences that make continued service feel morally impossible. Understanding these different motivations helps in both prevention and response. The most sophisticated internal threats are those that operate through legitimate channels and existing systems. Instead of obvious sabotage, they might provide biased information that leads to poor decisions, delay critical communications during time-sensitive situations, or use their authority to promote policies that serve external interests rather than organizational goals. These subtle forms of betrayal are often more damaging than dramatic acts of treason because they're harder to detect and prove. I developed what I call the loyalty auditor systematic process for evaluating the reliability of key personnel without creating an atmosphere of paranoia that destroys trust and effectiveness. This involves monitoring access to sensitive information, rotating responsibilities to prevent anyone from becoming indispensable, and maintaining multiple sources of intelligence about important developments. The Trojan horse also taught me about the importance of compartmentalization in organizational security. No individual should have access to all aspects of your operation, and critical decisions should involve multiple people who can check each other's work and motivations. This creates redundancy that protects against both innocent mistakes and deliberate sabotage. The psychology of internal security requires balancing vigilance with trust. Leaders who become too suspicious destroy the collaborative relationships necessary for effective organizations. But leaders who are too trusting create opportunities for devastating betrayals. The skill lies in maintaining appropriate caution while preserving the openness and confidence that enable good people to do their best work. I learned that the most effective defense against internal threats is creating an organizational culture where betrayal becomes psychologically difficult and practically unreal. This means investing in people's success, maintaining clear communication about expectations and consequences, and ensuring that loyal service is consistently recognized and rewarded, while disloyalty is swiftly addressed. The leaders who master internal security understand that perfect loyalty is impossible, but reliable service can be cultivated through systems that align individual interests with organizational success. They create environments where doing the right thing serves people's career goals, while doing the wrong thing carries clear costs that rational individuals will want to avoid. The philosopher's stone represents perhaps the most complex challenge facing any leader who must navigate the gap between personal morality and public necessity. The ability to transform base actions into noble outcomes, to make decisions that violate private conscience in service of greater good. Throughout my career, I struggled with the tension between the moral principles I was taught and the practical requirements of effective leadership in an imperfect world. I confronted this dilemma most acutely during my diplomatic missions, where I was required to make promises I knew might need to be broken, to withhold information from allies, and to support policies that would cause immediate harm to some people in order to prevent greater harm to many others. The psychology of moral flexibility in leadership requires a sophistication that most people, including most leaders, never develop. The fundamental issue is that private morality and public responsibility operate according to different principles. In your personal life, you can afford to be guided primarily by what feels right, what aligns with your values, and what allows you to sleep peacefully at night. But in leadership positions, you become responsible for outcomes that affect many people, and sometimes achieving good results requires methods that would be immoral in personal relationships. The philosopher's stone taught me that moral leadership is not about maintaining perfect purity of action, it's about accepting responsibility for necessary impurities while never losing sight of the purposes they serve. The leader who refuses to compromise moral principles often condemns others to suffer the consequences of his moral rigidity, which is itself a form of moral failure. I learned this lesson during negotiations with foreign powers, where absolute honesty would have disadvantaged Florence and harmed our citizens' interests. When the French demanded information that would have compromised our defenses, I provided misleading answers that protected our security. When rival city-states asked about our military capabilities, I allowed them to maintain useful misconceptions. These deceptions served the welfare of people who had entrusted me with their protection. The psychology of moral escape requires developing what I call ethical compartmentalization, the ability to separate your role-based obligations from your personal moral preferences without losing your fundamental humanity. This doesn't mean becoming amoral or cynical. It means accepting that different contexts create different moral frameworks. The most dangerous trap for leaders is moral absolutism, the belief that certain principles must never be violated regardless of consequences. I watched well-intentioned leaders destroy themselves and their causes by refusing to make necessary compromises, allowing perfect to become the enemy of good. Their moral purity was purchased at the cost of practical effectiveness. But the opposite extreme moral relativism that justifies any action by appealing to beneficial outcomes is equally destructive. The philosopher's stone requires maintaining core ethical principles while developing flexibility about methods. You must never lose sight of the fundamental purposes that justify moral complexity, and you must never use the difficulty of leadership as an excuse for actions that serve only your personal interests. I developed what I call the greater good tester framework for evaluating when moral compromise becomes necessary and justifiable. The action must serve purposes larger than personal benefit. It must prevent greater harm or create greater good than alternatives. It must be proportional to the threat or opportunity being addressed, and it must be reversible when circumstances change. The psychology of living with moral compromise requires a particular kind of mental discipline. You must accept responsibility for your choices without becoming paralyzed by guilt or regret. You must maintain awareness of the costs of your decisions without becoming cynical about the possibility of doing good. You must preserve your humanity While acknowledging that leadership sometimes requires inhuman choices, I learned to distinguish between moral flexibility and moral corruption by monitoring my motivations and maintaining accountability to purposes larger than myself. When I found myself enjoying the exercise of morally questionable power, or when I started rationalizing actions that served primarily my own interests, I recognized these as warning signs that I was crossing dangerous lines. The philosopher's stone ultimately taught me that moral leadership requires the courage to accept responsibility for imperfect choices in an imperfect world. The alternative moral paralysis that prevents necessary action is often more harmful than the compromises that effective leadership demands. The goal is not moral perfection, but moral effectiveness in service of outcomes that justify the complexity required to achieve them. The historian's quill has haunted my thoughts throughout my career, representing both the opportunity and the danger that comes with understanding how history will judge your actions. Throughout my observations of powerful leaders, I noticed a peculiar pattern. Those who became too concerned with their posthumous reputation often made decisions that undermined their effectiveness in the present, while those who ignored legacy considerations entirely sometimes achieved great things that were quickly forgotten or misunderstood. I learned about the psychology of legacy during my later years, when I began writing about political theory and reflecting on the lessons of my diplomatic career. The process of trying to explain my experiences and insights forced me to confront how my own actions would be remembered and interpreted by future generations who would lack the context that made certain decisions necessary or justifiable. The legacy trap operates on several psychological levels that most leaders fail to recognize. First, there's the natural human desire for immortality through reputation, the hope that being remembered positively will somehow extend our existence beyond death. This creates a temptation to prioritize actions that will look good to historians over actions that solve immediate problems effectively. Second, there's the challenge of temporal perspective. What appears wise and necessary in the moment may seem harsh or misguided when viewed through the lens of different times and different circumstances. Future generations will judge your decisions based on their values and their understanding of consequences you couldn't have foreseen. This creates an impossible standard that can paralyze decision-making if you let it. The historian's quill taught me that the most effective approach to legacy is what I call strategic. Enough about your reputation to avoid unnecessarily destructive actions, but not caring so much that you sacrifice effectiveness for appearance. The leaders who achieve lasting positive impact are usually those who focus on results rather than reputation. I observed this principle during my study of successful military commanders, who often had to make decisions that would be criticized by people who didn't understand military necessity. The commanders who tried to maintain popular approval during campaigns frequently lost battles that could have been won through harsher but more effective tactics. The commanders who focused on victory often faced criticism but ultimately earned respect for their results. The psychology of historical judgment is particularly complex because it operates through multiple filters of interpretation. Your contemporaries will judge you based on immediate consequences and their personal interests. The next generation will judge you based on how your actions affected their inheritance. Distant future generations will judge you based on abstract principles and incomplete information about your circumstances. This means that seeking historical vindication is often futile because different audiences will reach different conclusions regardless of your actual motivations and constraints. The historian's quill taught me that the only sustainable approach is to act according to the best information and judgment available at the time, while accepting that future evaluation will be based on standards you cannot predict or control. I developed what I call the legacy paradox principle, the understanding that leaders who try too hard to control their historical image often achieve the opposite of what they intend. They become cautious when boldness is needed. They prioritize appearance over substance. And they make decisions based on how they will be perceived, rather than what the situation requires. The most sophisticated approach to legacy management involves understanding the difference between reputation and impact. Reputation is what people think about you, which is largely beyond your control and often based on incomplete or biased information. Impact is the actual change you create in the world, which is more directly related to the quality of your decisions and actions. I learnt that the leaders who achieve positive legacies are usually those who solve important problems effectively, regardless of whether their methods conform to contemporary expectations of virtue or propriety. History tends to forgive harsh methods that produce beneficial results, while condemning gentle approaches that allow serious problems to fester and worsen. The historians. Quill also taught me about the importance of explaining your reasoning for posterity, even when you cannot justify your actions publicly at the time. Future generations may judge your decisions differently if they understand the constraints and considerations that influenced your thinking. This is why I have written extensively about political theory, not to excuse my actions, but to provide context that might help others understand the dilemmas that leadership creates. The legacy trap ultimately resolves through accepting that historical judgment is less important than immediate responsibility. Your primary obligation is to the people whose welfare depends on your decisions today, not to the historians who will evaluate your performance tomorrow. Paradoxically, this focus on present effectiveness often creates the kind of lasting positive impact that earns genuine historical respect. The corporate ladder stands before us as the modern manifestation of the same power dynamics I observed in Renaissance courts, proving that human nature and the fundamental principles of authority remain unchanged despite centuries of technological and social evolution. What I learned about power in Italian city-states applies directly to contemporary organizations. Though the language and methods have adapted to different contexts, I recognize in today's corporate hierarchies the same patterns of alliance, betrayal, strategic positioning, and psychological manipulation that dominated the political landscape of my era. The ambitious manager seeking promotion uses techniques remarkably similar to those employed by courtiers seeking royal favor. The CEO managing stakeholder expectations faces challenges comparable to those confronting princes, balancing competing noble factions. The psychology of organizational advancement operates according to principles I identified centuries ago. Merit alone rarely determines success, because human beings making promotion decisions are influenced by factors beyond objective performance. They respond to confidence, strategic relationships, timing, and perception management just as powerfully as they respond to technical competence or moral character. The corporate ladder taught me that the same strategic thinking I applied to diplomacy can guide career advancement in modern contexts. Understanding your organization's informal power structure is more important than memorizing the official hierarchy. Identifying whose opinions influence key decision makers matters more than impressing people with impressive titles but limited actual authority. I observe modern professionals making the same mistakes that destroyed ambitious nobles in my time. They focus exclusively on their immediate supervisor instead of building relationships across the organization. They assume that excellent work will be noticed and rewarded automatically, without understanding that visibility requires strategic effort. They ignore organizational politics as beneath their dignity, then wonder why less qualified competitors advance ahead of them. The principles of strategic positioning apply perfectly to corporate environments. Just as I advised princes to control key geographic territories, I would counsel today's professionals to establish control over critical information flows, essential relationships, and valuable resources within their organizations. Position. yourself where opportunities appear first, and where your contributions become difficult to ignore or replace. The psychology of fear and respect operates similarly in boardrooms and royal courts. Leaders who cannot inspire appropriate concern about consequences struggle to maintain authority when difficult decisions become necessary. The manager who desperately needs to be liked by everyone often becomes ineffective because team members learn they can ignore directives without facing meaningful accountability. But the application of these principles in modern contexts requires ethical sophistication that acknowledges the different moral framework of contemporary society. The techniques I described for Renaissance princes must be adapted to environments where transparency, collaboration, and legal constraints create different boundaries around acceptable behavior. The corporate ladder also represents the opportunity for broader positive impact that modern power structures create. Unlike the zero-sum political competitions of my era, contemporary organizations often enable win-win outcomes where individual advancement can serve larger purposes of innovation, economic development, and social progress. I see tremendous potential for applying strategic thinking to entrepreneurship and business leadership in ways that create value for many stakeholders simultaneously. The same skills that enabled successful princes to build lasting institutions can help modern leaders create organizations that solve important problems while providing opportunities for everyone involved. The psychology of modern power requires understanding how democratic institutions, media scrutiny, and global connectivity have changed the context for strategic action. Contemporary leaders operate under constraints that didn't exist in my time, but they also have access to tools and opportunities that Renaissance princes could never have imagined. The most important application of my insights to modern contexts involves ethical framework that channels strategic thinking toward beneficial outcomes. Understanding power dynamics protects you from manipulation while enabling you to navigate complex organizational environments more effectively. Recognizing psychological patterns helps you make better decisions about when to trust, when to be cautious, and when to act decisively. I encourage modern readers to study these principles not to become manipulative or Machiavellian in the pejorative sense, but to become more effective and influential in their chosen fields. The world needs people who understand how power works and who can use that understanding to create positive change rather than merely advancing their personal interests. The moral compass has guided my final reflections on how the insights I've shared can be used responsibly in a world that desperately needs ethical leadership, but often rewards those who abuse power for selfish purposes. Throughout this exploration of power's psychology, I have wrestled with the tension between revealing dangerous knowledge and providing tools that ethical people need to compete effectively against those who have no moral constraints. I want to be absolutely clear about the responsibility that comes with understanding these principles. Knowledge of power dynamics can be used to manipulate others for personal gain, to exploit psychological weaknesses for selfish advantage, or to build systems that serve only the interests of those in control. But the same knowledge can also be used to recognize manipulation when you encounter it, to protect yourself and others from psychological exploitation, and to build influence that serves beneficial purposes. The distinction between ethical and unethical application of these insights lies primarily in the purposes they serve and the consideration given to the welfare of others. When you use strategic thinking to advance your career, are you creating value for your organization and colleagues, or are you simply taking what others deserve? When you manage perceptions, are you highlighting genuine accomplishments and capabilities, or are you creating false impressions that harm people who trust you? The moral compass taught me that ethical leaders must understand power psychology precisely because unethical leaders will use these techniques whether ethical leaders understand them or not. Your ignorance of strategic dynamics doesn't make you morally superior, it often makes you ineffective and vulnerable to those who have no such constraints. I observe contemporary leaders who pride themselves on avoiding politics while allowing toxic individuals to manipulate situations and harm good people. Their moral purity becomes complicity in systems that reward the worst aspects of human nature while punishing virtue and competence. This is not ethical leadership. It's moral abdication disguised as righteousness. The responsible application of power psychology requires constant attention to the broader impacts of your actions. When you build alliances, are you creating relationships that benefit all parties involved? Or are you using people as stepping stones to be discarded when convenient? When you manage information strategically, are you protecting legitimate interests and preventing unnecessary conflict? Or are you deceiving people to gain unfair advantages? I learned that the most ethical approach to power is what I call enlightened self-interest, pursuing your legitimate goals through methods that also benefit others whenever possible, and accepting constraints on your behavior that serve important social values, even when those constraints cost you personally. This requires a sophistication that goes beyond simple rule following to encompass genuine care for the communities and institutions you're part of. The moral compass also taught me about the importance of accountability in the exercise of strategic influence. Ethical leaders subject themselves to feedback and criticism. They explain their reasoning when appropriate, and they accept responsibility for both intended and unintended consequences of their actions. They understand that power without accountability inevitably corrupts even well-intentioned people. The psychology of ethical power requires maintaining what I call moral vigilance, constant attention to whether your methods and goals remain aligned with your fundamental values. Power creates temptations and rationalizations that can gradually erode your ethical standards. If you're not actively resistant to these pressures, the techniques that seem necessary for survival can become habits that poison your character. If you're not careful, I encourage readers to develop personal, ethical frameworks that can guide their application of these insights in specific situations. What are your non-negotiable principles that must never be violated, regardless of potential benefits? What are your core purposes that justify strategic complexity when simpler approaches would be insufficient? What accountability mechanisms will help you maintain perspective on whether your actions serve worthy goals? The ultimate test of ethical power is whether you're creating systems and relationships that you would want to live under if you weren't in control. Are you building organizations that bring out the best in people? Or are you creating environments where only the most ruthless can thrive? Are you using your influence to solve important problems, or merely to advance your personal status and comfort? The moral compass reminds us that understanding power is not optional for anyone who wants to create positive change in a complex world. But how you use that understanding will determine whether you become part of the solution or part of the problem that ethical leaders must solve. The eternal flame burns before me as I reflect on the unchanging nature of power across centuries, reminding me that the struggles I witnessed in Renaissance Italy continue in every boardroom, every political campaign, and every human organization where people compete for influence and authority. What I discovered about the dark psychology of absolute power remains as relevant today as it was 500 years ago, because human nature itself remains constant despite all our technological and social progress. In sharing these insights with you, I have revealed truths that most people prefer to ignore: that virtue without power often accomplishes nothing, that good intentions without strategic thinking frequently lead to harmful outcomes, that the world judges results rather than motives, and that understanding psychology gives, tremendous advantages to those willing to use that knowledge effectively. I have shown you how fear can be more reliable than love, how deception sometimes serves truth, how betrayal emerges from the people closest to power, and how moral purity can become complicity in systems that reward the worst aspects of human behavior. These are uncomfortable realities that challenge much of what we're taught about leadership and ethics, but ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. The eternal flame represents my hope that this knowledge will be used by people who genuinely want to create positive change rather than merely advance their personal interests. The techniques I've described are morally neutral tools that become beneficial or harmful depending on the purposes they serve and the character of those who employ them. As I reach the end of my years, I see clearly that power is not evil in itself. It is necessary for accomplishing anything significant in a world where competing interests and limited resources create inevitable conflicts. The question is not whether power will be exercised, but whether it will be exercised by people who understand its responsibilities as well as its opportunities. My greatest fear is that ethical people will abandon the pursuit of influence to those who have no moral constraints, creating systems where virtue becomes weakness and manipulation becomes the only path to authority. This outcome serves no one except those who profit from chaos and exploitation. My greatest hope is that readers will understand these principles well enough to recognize them when others use them, wise enough to apply them ethically in their own lives, and strong enough to build institutions that channel human ambition toward beneficial outcomes for everyone involved. The struggle between those who would use power responsibly and those who would abuse it for selfish purposes is eternal, because it reflects fundamental aspects of human nature that will never be eliminated through education, legislation, or good intentions alone. Each generation must learn these lessons anew and must choose whether to engage with power's realities or to retreat into comfortable illusions that leave the field to less scrupulous competitors. I leave you with this final thought. Understanding the dark psychology of power is not about becoming dark yourself. It's about seeing clearly enough to be effective in a world where others may not share your ethical constraints. Use this knowledge to protect yourself and those you care about. Use it to build influence that serves purposes larger than your personal advancement. Use it to create organizations and relationships that bring out the best in human nature, rather than rewarding the worst. The eternal flame burns on, waiting to see whether each new generation will prove wise enough to handle power responsibly or foolish enough to repeat the tragic mistakes that have destroyed so many promising leaders throughout history. You now possess the same insights that guided princes and shaped empires. The choice of how to use this knowledge rests entirely with you. Will you apply these principles to create value and solve important problems? Or will you use them merely to advance your personal interests at others' expense? Will you become someone who makes organizations and communities better through your influence? Or will you become another cautionary tale about the corruption that power can bring? The world watches and waits. The eternal flame illuminates your path forward, but only you can choose the direction you will take. Make that choice wisely, for it will determine not only your own legacy, but also the kind of world you leave behind for those who will follow in your footsteps. Remember always that with great understanding comes great responsibility. Use what I have taught you well.